Okay, so I'm going to make a start because we only have an hour today. So welcome to this webinar. I'm very happy to be here today and I hope you've enjoyed the day so far. My name is Dr. Natalie Isaia. I am here on behalf of BGPS, Brett Grelier Psychology Services. I'm a clinical psychologist. So I've been qualified for around 5 years and I've spent that time working within the homelessness sector. Used to work frontline in a large homeless hospital in central London, doing PI with them and helping them implement PI, psychologically informed environment. And now I'm working to the back off the front line, so I spend most of my time delivering training and facilitating reflective practice. So I still sort of have a good understanding of what's going on the ground, but I'm trying to work supporting staff now. So today we're going to talk about what are boundaries and why boundaries are important, and we're going to focus quite a lot on sort of personal boundaries, so time boundaries, emotional boundaries, because these are the ones that we often struggle with the most. So why are boundaries important? Well, in our line of work, boundaries are absolutely essential to keep us safe and our clients or customers safe. So when you think about it, our professional boundaries are actually quite arbitrary from sort of an attachment view, from an evolutionary point of view. We work relationally. We have to develop relationships with people in order to do the work we do effectively. You know what your professional boundaries are because you've had training and you've got your job description and you've had experience in your role. But it's really helpful to remember that anyone else is probably going to intuitively struggle a little bit to understand your professional role boundaries, because actually we haven't evolved to develop an attachment, a quite close attachment to somebody for a year or 2 years, you know, really share with them our traumas, receive their support, and then say, okay, bye, I'm never going to see you again. It doesn't feel intuitive. So from that point of view, these boundaries might seem quite arbitrary, but we know that they're absolutely critical to work safely with people. So if somebody is confused about what our boundaries are with them, when it is time to move on, if you have to leave your job, if you go on holiday, when you go home at the end of the day, that person's going to feel hurt and confused. So it's absolutely critical that we know what our boundaries are and that we hold our boundaries. And these boundaries help other people know what to expect from us. So often when we get angry, it's because our expectations haven't been met. We thought one thing was going to happen and then something else has happened. So if we're really clear, we can expect from other people, that generally helps things go more smoothly. We often feel guilty about holding our boundaries. So I'm going to come back to this a few times in today's session. People don't thank you for holding your boundaries at any age. I've never heard a sort of a 5-year-old say, oh, thanks for not letting me have chocolate before dinner. But in the long run, everyone feels better for the reasons that I've just described. In terms of our emotional boundaries, we work with a lot of clients and customers who have had a lot of trauma. Many of us have experienced trauma ourselves. So there's a lot of what psychologists call emotional contagion, transference in our work. And this puts us at risk of burnout. It puts us at risk of vicarious trauma and moral injury, which is a concept which unfortunately I don't have time to go into today, but something that's very relevant to all of us in our work, and we do other trainings on moral injury. So we have to have healthy emotional boundaries for you to be effective in your job over the long term, because if you're burnt out, if you're sort of really taking in the trauma of everybody that you're working with, you won't be able to be an effective professional. You won't be able to support them, because at that point you're down that hole with them and needing support yourself. So what we need to remember is it's our professional responsibility to understand our boundaries and hold self-care, emotional boundaries. It's not this extra nice thing that you'll get to do if you get through your to-do list. They are absolutely part of your professional responsibility. And I think that can help us to hold them, because if we think of it as a responsibility and not a luxury, then that helps us to be assertive with ourselves in terms of actually putting these things into practice rather than feeling guilty for taking your lunch break, or going home at the end of the day and actually enjoying your evening with your family rather than continuing to check your work emails. So there are various types of boundaries. This isn't an exhaustive slide. This is just the graphic I normally use to help us think about the different categories of boundaries. So you've got your legal and professional boundaries. So in theory, these are your non-negotiable boundaries. Policy and procedures, anything around confidentiality, physical safety. This is things like, don't sell drugs to customers, don't have sex with your customers. So these are things that you cannot do for good reason. Some people may feel that their organisation's policies and procedures are not very psychologically informed, in which case, obviously, we need to be trying to work at a more systemic level to get those policies and procedures to a point where they're usable and effective. But we should all know what they are. We should all know what the baseline is, so we're at least aware if those are being crossed or not. The containment boundaries are around where we're trying to manage sort of distressed behaviour, or what we often refer to in services as challenging behaviour. So we want to be able to help the people that we're supporting understand where the limits are in terms of their behaviour in our services. And to do this, we need to have fair and consistent rules, and if necessary and appropriate, fair and consistent sanctions. So I'll be coming back to that, a little slide on that in a minute. Bottom two boxes there are more about our boundaries within ourselves. So we have a time boundary, which falls slightly into two categories. So again, in terms of working with our clients and customers, there's another element of containing our more anxious clients. So people who, they want to see you for 3-4 hours a day when actually you've got a larger caseload and you need to spread your time more equally, or the clients who sort of phone us 50 times in a day because they need that reassurance. So again, I will be touching on that in a later slide. And then for our own wellbeing, we need to take responsibility for managing our own schedule, trying to put reasonable boundaries around the time that we're spending at work. And that slides into this personal box over here, your sort of personal, emotional boundaries. So how much you're sort of emotionally engaging with work, with your clients, what's your work-life balance like? And that's what we're going to focus on in the second half of today's. This is a graphic I stole from somewhere else, but it's just really to illustrate that boundaries are often not black and white. They're not all or nothing. It's often a bit of a spectrum. There are often grey areas, there's often ambiguity. So it's really helpful to keep reflecting, to think, where am I on the right side of boundaries? Like, I'm definitely within appropriate boundaries. Where have I definitely violated boundaries? So the examples here are entering into a sexual relationship with a customer, borrowing or giving money, abusive behaviour, including with illegal behaviours. I hope us here today would say, 100% no, that is a boundary violation. And then you've got your boundary crossing, which this is the interesting bit that requires us to use reflective practice, use our team spaces to talk to each other and think through the different situations. So where sort of technically it's a boundary crossing, but where people probably with good intentions may inadvertently do these things. So this might look like spending free time with a customer, keeping secrets, feeling possessive, that thing with, it's my client, I have to be in, or if you're a manager, it's being my service, I must come in on a Saturday because service won't function without me unless I'm there. So just this idea that it's a spectrum. And as I said, really with boundaries, the important thing is reflection, reflection, reflection. So making sure that we are thinking through what we're doing. Is this psychologically informed? Is this trauma informed? Why am I doing this? And are we doing it consistently as a team? So let's go back to that yellow box, what I call containment boundaries. So psychologically informed environments, trauma-informed care. Thankfully, this is now popping up on lots of tenders, on lots of sort of service specs, and that's a really good thing. but it can be misunderstood, as just let the customers and clients do whatever they want because they've experienced trauma. So yeah, the client's really abusive towards you, but it's your job. Just go to work, just suck it up. That is not fine. That is not being trauma informed. It does not create a safe environment. The staff don't feel safe and the clients don't feel safe. If someone is shouting at you, if they're very angry and upset, and there's no containment around them, there's no limit, they don't feel safe either. They feel uncontained and out of control. And of course, other clients won't feel safe as well. So being trauma informed very much includes having kind of nice, firm boundaries, flexible where necessary, but firm and consistent. That might sound like a contradiction in terms, but it isn't. And again, when you've had all that reflection, you can work out how to find that nice middle ground between consistency and flexibility. So ideally, where we have a set of kind of limits, rules, boundaries, these will be collaboratively agreed with everybody. So if we're working in an absolutely ideal world, we're going to have all of our customers and clients involved in this discussion, all of our stuff, so that everyone's empowered. And if you're being really pie, you can frame these as rights and responsibilities, because as soon as you say the word rule, people want to push against it. Whereas if we reframe it as rights and responsibilities, we're talking about the same thing, but it's intuitively more psychologically informed. The staff have a right to come into work, not abused. Clients have a right to be treated with respect and not be condescended or patronised. So, you know, you can frame these nicely in any way that you want to achieve the same goal. These rules need to be consistently held if they're going to work. So there is absolutely no point having sort of team agreements, and some people are holding them and some people aren't. If we think of the classic sort of thing where the child knows that one caregiver is always going to say yes and the other one's going to say no, the caregiver who's holding the healthy boundaries is going to end up looking like the bad guy. And there's going to be lots of sort of behavioural issues as a result there, because there's going to be splitting. So as a child, I know, well, if I just go to this caregiver, get what I want. So they absolutely have to be held consistently. They need to be fair and achievable. So again, if we're thinking about optimal development, the way that human beings learn boundaries is by having those limits put around them. And the limits we put around children need to be age appropriate. They need to be sort of developmentally appropriate. And that's exactly the same for all of our customers, no matter how old they are. We need to think about the trauma that they've been through. We need to think about the development that they've been through, what their life looked like and where that leaves them. Did they have the opportunity to learn what those boundaries are? Where are they in terms of their journey? And what do they need to feel safe, and what does the service need to feel safe? So those boundaries need to take into account the psychological needs of everybody, the staff and the clients, which again is a balancing act. Pie is all about the middle ground. This is why we have to be so thoughtful, because the psychological needs of the staff might in some ways conflict the psychological needs of the customers, but there will be a middle ground. We need to give it thought. Where we are using sanctions, those need to be used fairly and consistently as well. So again, people can't learn if they feel like they're being treated unfairly, or, you know, well, I got away with this yesterday, why are you punishing me for this now? Children and adults alike, if we're going to learn from a mistake, we can't have our attachment broken, because that puts us into a higher state of threat and we can't learn. So for children, this would look like, you know, appropriately sanctioning but not removing the love. If you're in a family setting, and in our service setting, it's about making sure that we don't remove that support, so that they still feel the warmth and the support that we're giving them. And we're actually good at this. Most services will have psychologically informed sanctions where we sit down with people and say, okay, let's talk about this. What happened? Went wrong? How can we support you? What can we do differently next time? The bit that we often don't do so much in services is following up. So most of you will be working with clients whose whole sense of self is negative. They've been, told off again and again, criticized, put down, kicked out of places, just punished through their life. So their sense of self is, I do bad things, I'm a bad person. So if we're giving them a sanction, it's kind of water off a duck's back often. It's like, well, what are you going to do? Like, yeah, I know, I've just done something wrong again. What changes the behavior, therefore, isn't the sanction, but it's the positive reinforcement, it's the follow-up. So this is the bit that most services do have a little bit of work to do in terms of finding the time to do this. So often if somebody stops a behavior that we've given them a warning for, we think, oh, good, I can get on and deal with the next crisis. But we've got to take the time to meet again with that person around a week later, no more than 2 weeks later, and sit down and really acknowledge where they've at least tried to shift the behavior. So even if it hasn't been completely resolved, we can say that we can really see that you're trying, to have more respectful conversations and stuff. And we really appreciate that. I really enjoyed chatting to you yesterday. It was lovely to, hear about your interest in art and have a nice conversation with you. I'd like to do more of that. So genuine, authentic, positive reinforcement. It has to be authentic, otherwise, again, doesn't tend to work. So top tips around the containment boundaries: make sure that you all know where your boundaries are. This is what reflective practice is. It's about coming together and making the implicit explicit and making sure you're all on the same page. Then making sure that those are clearly stated to the people that you're supporting and their friends and family and other professionals, because as I said at the beginning, our professional boundaries are made up and you might know what they are and you yes, but you have to communicate very clearly to other people. You can then assume that they will be pushed. So I'm a bit of a broken record. One thing I always say in my reflective practice is it is your client's job to push the boundaries and it is your job to hold the boundaries forever and ever and ever, and that dynamic is never going to change. So you need to be prepared for that, and when your boundaries are pushed, you can use a circle of strategies like the broken record technique. The broken record technique is where somebody might be escalating, getting more upset, but you don't escalate. You just same tone, very calm, just stating your statement in the same words again. So we might automatically think, oh, I need to say something different. They're not listening. I need to say it louder. I need to rephrase it. But when people are very upset, they find it harder to take in information. So actually, it's much more effective just to make sure that you're giving that piece of information clearly until that person is able to take it in. So a couple of examples here. Obviously, these aren't, you wouldn't necessarily say this word for word. This is just for the sake of giving examples. If you're putting boundaries around somebody who's being a bit angry and aggressive, it's showing that you're supporting them, but making sure that they know that you have a boundary that they can't cross. So, for example, I want to support you with this, but I can't support you if you're shouting. If you continue to shout, I'm going to have to end the call. And you might say that a couple of times, and then if they continue to shout, you end the call, or you leave the room, or whatever the context is. For anxious clients, what I mentioned before, this is a time boundary idea. So just helping the client to understand, in order to complete this work, I need time to focus on it. I can take 1 10-minute call from you a day at 3 o'clock each day, but if you call me at other times, I'm not going to pick up. And then beyond that, it's about you holding the boundary, because if you don't hold the boundary, no one's going to respect the boundary. I've had so many conversations with staff say things like, I told this client again and again that I work 9 to 5 and they still call me at 11 p.m. And I'm like, do you answer at 11 p.m? Because every time you pick up the phone at 11 p.m, you're just showing them that they can call you at 11 p.m. So once we've set the boundary, it's our responsibility to hold that. And you need to be reliable. So in this anxious client example, if you don't pick up when you say you're going to pick up, again, it sort of all falls apart. You have to be consistent, you have to be reliable. And then again, if you're working in a super psychologically informed way for anxious clients and angry clients, I suppose, you can have conversations with them around offering basic psychological tools so that they can manage in between calls. So it might be helping someone think about what they can access is there someone else you can speak to? What soothes them? Do they enjoy going for a walk, having a bath? Do they do some breathing and meditation? And over time, their anxiety will decrease because they will learn, oh, well, actually, I can manage for an hour. And, Lucy is going to be there when she says she's going to be. So over many months, that anxiety is going to reduce and the behaviour will reduce. We're going to do a little quiz now. So we at BGPS, we do a boundaries workshop, and it's my favourite activity workshop to do out of all of our trainings because it's so interactive. So you've got 3 questions here. They are deliberately vague. And when we do this in person, these sorts of questions we can personalize into the team. We can kind of really hone in on the types of boundaries that your team need to be discussing and reflecting on, and it gives lots of room to discuss the grey areas, and you always find that there are people with sort of differences of opinion. Even if you think a boundary is obvious, you may have a colleague who doesn't hold that point of view. But as I said, we have to have consistency within our team. So even if you don't fully agree with the team decision on a boundary, it's so important to have that shared approach. So I can't see how many people have voted so far, but we'll see when enough people have voted, we will see the responses. So you've got 3 multiple choice options for each one. So you can choose, yes, it's always okay to do this, it's sometimes okay to do this, or it's never okay to do this. And in the workshop, we've actually moved different areas of the room, that the whole quiz process lasts for at least an hour. It's really, really interactive and really engaging. And always very, very interesting to hear people's opinions. We were getting some responses there. Okay, I can see in the chat someone said that they can't see the poll. So apologies for that if it's not come up. I think we've had around 30 responses, so I think definitely you can see it. It should have come up as a little pop-up that says quiz. How are we doing, Faye? Can we share the results now? Okay. So let's see what people said. So question 1, is it okay to initiate physical contact with a client and customer? So about 40% of us have said sometime, about 59% of us have said never. So obviously I can't have a back and forth conversation with you, but from experience, this conversation usually goes along the lines of lots of sort of what ifs. So, well, surely it's okay to shake hands with the customer, right? Or, if someone's really crying, they're really upset, why can't I put my hand on their shoulder to comfort them? This one, technically, the correct answer is it's never okay to initiate physical contact with a customer. The reason is because if somebody has experienced a lot of trauma, some very benign physical contact that you may initiate, as I said, like putting a hand on a shoulder, to them might be received in quite a magnified way for lots of reasons. Again, unfortunately, we don't have the time today to sort of explore this. But the appropriate boundary is not to initiate physical contact. Similarly with shaking hands, because if maybe somebody has OCD, maybe somebody has cultural and religious beliefs that actually sort of prevent them from it being culturally acceptable, and you haven't realised that. But if somebody's got their hand out, it's quite difficult to reject it. So somebody may actually feel a little coerced into shaking your hand. So you haven't intentionally done anything wrong, but you just don't know what the impact is going to be on the other person. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, no, I've never put my hand on a client's shoulder who's upset. So this is where you have like those reflective conversations. But as I said, it's quite important to know where the boundaries should be, so that if you ever do cross it, you can then take a second afterwards and think, okay, I did put my hands on the client's arm because they were crying on this occasion. Now let me think about why. Was it okay? Actually, do I need to rethink that? What was the reason I felt it was okay? How could that have been received by the client? And it might be that it was absolutely fine. My rule of thumb with boundaries is that it's the only time I'm ever going to tell people to catastrophize. So as a psychologist, I normally try to stop people catastrophizing and doing the what if scenario. But actually with boundaries, I would encourage you to think, well, what if, because that's how you figure out why might it not be okay. Because 90% of the time in our work, those things aren't going to cause a problem. But unfortunately, we work with a lot of risk, work with a lot of trauma, and those worst case scenarios do happen in our services, not uncommonly. So it's so crucial in our services to think, okay, well, you know, that 2% of the time, this can result in this really significant issue. So our boundaries, we're not going to do that. Is it okay to leave a room or a residence in the middle of a meeting if you're feeling physically intimidated by a customer? So again, 18% of people here saying sometimes. If I could talk to you, I'd ask you to give me examples of when you feel like that isn't okay. It's always okay, because you're never at work to be abused or intimidated ever. So if you're feeling unsafe, it's always okay to take yourself away to replace the safety. Obviously, if you feel the client is at risk as well, come back with help. Don't just abandon them and go home. But your safety is always a priority. And the last one, is it okay to disclose personal information to a client or customer? And we've got a mixture between sometimes and never. This one generally falls into sometimes. So again, you have to build relationships, and it totally depends on your personal sort of boundaries, how much you want to disclose. There are some obvious limits, like we don't want a client to know every single personal detail about us, because then they become our therapist. But it's probably fine to give a little bit of information. So if you know, a client said to me, do you have kids? I'm okay saying no, I don't have kids, and I feel okay with that. And thinking it through, I'm thinking, what am I going to share and what am I not going to share? So again, and I'm repeating myself, but this is important, it's all about every single situation thinking, why am I holding this boundary, or why am I crossing this boundary? Is it in the best interest of the psychological needs of both me and my client? So sort of just in summary on those, people often overstep boundaries. They're almost always doing it with good intention. We're human beings and we work with other human beings, and our intuition often wants to help people in a way that is technically crossing a professional boundary. So it's hard to hold these artificial boundaries, but again, they are crucial, and that's why we need to keep reflecting. Okay, so I was asked to focus more on sort of emotional boundaries, personal boundaries today. This idea of work-life balance, I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge the state of the sector at the moment. We are at a point in time where the sector has more and more over, say, the last decade, developed this culture of wanting more for less, competitive tendering. We used to, well, we still do talk about burnout as an imbalance between our internal resources and our workload, our stress. But actually, now people are leaving because they actually don't have the resources. It's not like you need to go on a resilience course. It's like, I'm being asked to do 3 persons work because our team is so short-staffed and I can't deliver what we need to deliver. It's actually not possible. So for the rest of this section, I will be talking about how to do your best to hold your boundaries, but I am not promoting this sort of toxic positivity idea of like, if you just self-care and if you just hold your boundaries, you'll be fine and you'll get everything done, because it's a struggle to try to find this balance when we're short-staffed, we're underpaid, when we can't pay our bills, so we're having to work overtime to actually pay our rent. That no longer becomes a choice of like, oh, well, I should just leave at 5. So it is a systemic issue, increasingly so, and yet there is always an element of our work-life balance and our emotional well-being that we can always take personal responsibility for, and it's that element. So sometimes you have to stay late. Sometimes you have to skip a lunchtime. We're not talking about boundaries that are so rigid that we're being unrealistic, but so often in our sector, people have just got into the habit of not holding boundaries. So there's a big difference in mindset from somebody saying, you know, working in a really busy service and we're short staffed, so several times a week I'm not able to have my lunch, or I had to work late a couple of nights this week because it's end of quarter and I have to get, you know, these support plans done, versus someone who says, oh no, I haven't taken a lunch break in years, we don't take breaks, because that's habit. That's just, you've just given up and decided that you're not going to try and hold that boundary anymore. So sometimes it's habit, also sometimes it's anxiety driven. So in reflective practice, there's often a lot of talk about, you know, I really have the urge to check emails out of hours. I can't stop thinking about work, especially managers, because you have that higher level of responsibility. Or people will say like, oh, I have to check my emails on a Sunday night so that I can sleep well, because, you know, then I know what I'm going into on Monday. I can mentally prepare. These are anxiety-driven checking behaviours. And Psychology 101 is that any anxiety-driven behaviour that's threat-driven is probably not going to be helpful. It's probably going to perpetuate the problem and increase the anxiety. So although it's very difficult, you can retrain your brain to learn that the service is going to be okay without you. Of course, again, I'm not, there are going to be times when you are actually needed, but so often we have this sort of saviour complex. And in a really compassionate way, we need to remind ourselves that, you know, we're nobody's saviour. I'm not a hero. I'm one person working in a team, and actually my colleagues are also good at their jobs, and I need to trust them. So ideally, the team culture should support this, because it's fine to try to sort of manage your own personal boundaries, but if no one else in your service is doing it, that's very hard. So as a team, trying to shift away from everyone feeling guilty for taking their lunch break or leaving on time, and just making that the team culture, just encouraging everyone to take responsibility for holding the boundaries. If you're a manager, this applies to you more than anyone else, because if you tell your team to have their lunch break, if you tell them to have good boundaries and they see you not doing that, they won't, because they'll feel guilty. We learn by modeling. So it's even more of a responsibility if you're a manager to model good self-care and good time boundaries, because that is going to enable the team and everyone underneath you to do the same. There's also lots of tools that we can use for this. This is an example of one, something that you could print out and put up on your office wall. It's just the idea that we are intentionally sort of psychologically checking ourselves out of the day. So at the end of the day, just, for example, taking a moment to just reflect, thinking about something that was difficult, thinking about things that went well, because again, in our jobs, we're so often focusing on the negative. So other aspects of wellbeing is around training our brain to balance that by seeing the positives as well. And then if we're left with something, thinking, well, what do I need? You know, I'm left feeling anxious, I'm left feeling frustrated. What do I need to do so that I can go home and actually enjoy my evening and have that separation? So again, realistically speaking, sounds great in theory, doesn't it? But we all have managers, and our managers have to, because it's their job, a lot of pressure on it. So everyone at every stage of the hierarchy is under pressure from the people above them. And you know, the commissioners, I don't know if we've got any commissioners here today, but the commissioners have their targets, and it's all sort of feeding down through the system. So sometimes you do have to manage up, and depending on your personality, that might be easier or harder for you. So the idea of assertiveness is about finding a balance between my needs and your needs. So it's not just kind of pushing back on your manager or, well, my manager's really mean. It's about understanding that your manager has a lot of pressure on them, and that there are realistic targets, and figuring out how to, again, communicate and find the middle ground. So an example of this might sound like, if your manager is kind of giving you lots of extra tasks and you're looking at your diary thinking, this is just not possible. Like, even if I worked 24 hours a day, I'm not going to get through this. Going to your manager and saying, look, I can understand that we're under pressure as a service to meet these targets. Of course, I want our service to perform well. Let's look together. Here's my calendar and my to-do list. As you can see, there's no time for me to get all of this done. So you help me, you tell me what you want me to prioritize. Because you're not saying no, you're not being aggressive and saying, I'm not doing that, you do that, that's not my job. But you're also not being passive and just taking on more and more and more and more until you burn out. You're collaborating. You're trying to meet, everyone's needs. That would be an example of assertiveness to colleagues. Again, it's not a magic wand. Sometimes your manager might not respond very well to that, but in terms of positive approaches, this is the type of approach I'd be recommending. But then we need to be assertive with ourselves as well. So when you are stressed, when your fight and flight mode is on, your brain is going to lie to you. Your brain is going to scream at you and go, don't have time to stop. Don't have time to go to the break. You don't have time to have lunch or go to the bathroom. Just keep going. Because that's what our brains do. That is how our brains have evolved. And it's trying to keep us safe. Our brains are well-meaning, but they're wrong. A lot of the time, our brain tells us a lot of lies a lot of the time. I would bet that for all of you, even if you work 24/7, you still wouldn't get through your to-do list. That's, again, just the reality of our services. So again, we need to step back. We need to be assertive with ourselves and realize that we don't have time not to stop. Because as I've already said, if you're burnt out, you can't help anyone else. So that threat mode that you're, the screaming voice inside your brain telling you that, you don't have time to stop, otherwise you're going to fail and everything's going to fall apart. We have to bring assertiveness to that. We have to learn to sort of take some control of that, but not in an aggressive way that's fighting back. We need to do it by using self-compassion. So self-compassion is not this weak, fluffy, nice thing. Self-compassion is often not nice. Self-compassion is often very difficult. And it's often, the compassionate action often isn't the easy action. So you're not shouting back at yourself saying, shut up, I'm just going to stop work today and just go to the pub and just, back it all off. You're coaching yourself. So you're thinking, okay, what would I say to a friend or a colleague if they were in this situation? And as soon as you think that, your brain will probably say something like, oh, well, I've told them that, they've achieved a lot today and they have to get this done before they go home because this is a kind of a risk issue. But the rest of it is just going to have to wait till tomorrow because they need to, go home at some point and the service isn't going to fall apart. So you'll immediately start to think in a way that's more realistic. So that's my self-compassion hack. Self-compassion, again, it's a whole of the training, it's a whole of the skill set. It's one that I think is absolutely crucial for us as professionals in this sector. I put a resource slide on here and there's a link to a self-compassion, it's a self-help booklet that you can go if you're interested in this. I would highly recommend that. Basic self-care, you might be thinking this is so obvious, but actually it's a big part of boundaries. So you can't hold your boundaries if you're not looking after yourself. And I spend most of my time during the week talking about going back to basics. So we have to remember that something feeling difficult isn't the same as not coping. So managing your stress doesn't mean not feeling stressed. Managing your anger doesn't mean not feeling angry. It means that you're choosing behaviours that are helpful in light of those feelings and that you're still able to sort of cope and get things done. In the same way, emotion regulation, regulating our emotions, isn't emotional suppression. So don't forget the basics, basically. We need to be tuning into our emotions. We need to be understanding what we need. We need to be making sure that our basic self-care is integrated into our day-to-day. So whether it's remembering to do breathing exercise several times throughout the day, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, it sounds like, well, what difference is that going to make? But it really, these basics really do help your body come out of threat mode, to help physiologically switch you onto your parasympathetic nervous system, onto your soothing system. And again, I put it there again, self-care is a responsibility. It's not a luxury. It's not like, oh, if I get everything done, then I'll have a bath on Sunday night. You have to do this. Take your lunch break as a responsibility. Put it on your to-do list and tick it off. And obviously this takes practice. So holding boundaries and self-care, they're uncomfortable when you first start trying to do it. It's like when we first start exercising, or when I was trying to get into the habit of flossing, for example. These things are painful and uncomfortable. So you go to the gym once and then you're achy, or you floss once and your gums really hurt, and you think, oh, I don't want to do that again, and you stop. But if you keep doing it, just build it up little by little and do it consistently, after a while you feel so much better for it. Your overall health is improved and it stops becoming uncomfortable. So when you start to hold boundaries, if it feels uncomfortable, that's fine. Keep going. When you start doing self-care, if it feels like, you know, what's the point? It's not working, keep going. It will build up over time. It just takes practice. So just a slide here again on, this is about emotional boundaries, really. So how do we hold those emotional boundaries when we go home from work and we can't get our clients out of our head? We're worried about them, we're thinking about that awful trauma story that we had earlier. What do you do? So it's normal to feel distressed. We work with a lot of distress. So pushing it away, cutting it off, can be effective sometimes, but if that's your only strategy, it's suppression. And this is a little pink elephant thought exercise, where if I told you to, you know, think about anything for the next 10 seconds, but not a pink elephant, don't think about a pink elephant, don't think about a pink elephant, don't think about a pink elephant, you're going to think about a pink elephant because you're focusing so hard on not thinking about it. So managing our distress, managing our emotional boundaries is once again about finding the balance. We want to not suppress, but not dwell. And there are some psychological tools here that can help you with this. So mindfulness is something that is widely misunderstood. Mindfulness is not about making your mind go blank. It's not about being super relaxed. Mindfulness means when you are able to notice when your mind has wandered and then refocus your attention. So when you're doing the mindfulness exercise, let's say you do 60 seconds of breathing and you get distracted 100 times within that minute, and each time you notice you've got distracted and you really focus on the breathing, amazing. You've just done mindfulness 100 times in a minute. So if that's you and you feel really frustrated with yourself, thinking I'm not doing this properly, you're doing it amazingly. That's exactly the chance. And it's a muscle. So the more you do that, the better you will be able to refocus your attention off things that you don't want to be thinking about or aren't helpful at that time, and go to sleep or pay attention to your partner. Leaves on a stream is a nice way of practicing this. There's many thought diffusion exercises. This is just an example. There's a link on the resource slide. Leaves on a stream is visualization, where you visualize putting your thoughts on a leaf and watching it float down a stream. And it's practicing getting some distance from our thoughts. So just saying, okay, hey, I see your thought, but I don't need to engage with you right now. I'll deal with you later. But as I said, we don't want to be completely avoidant. So I often recommend worry time as a nice way to find this middle ground. So if you're somebody who spends hours ruminating, worry time is a way of reducing the amount of time you spend ruminating. So you pick a time, not just before bed, let's say early evening, and you spend 10-15 minutes just sitting and letting your brain go wherever it wants, whatever it wants to worry about. But then at the end of that time, you set a timer, go and do something else. And then the rest of the day, those thoughts will come back, but you do the mindfulness thing. You say, okay, hey thought, hey worry, I see you, but it's not worry time. I'll deal with you at 5 p.m. tomorrow. I'm focusing on this right now. So much easier said than done. Really, really hard to do, but like everything else, the more you practice, the more effectively you'll be able to do it. So there are lots of barriers to holding boundaries. I've touched on a few, but I just really wanted to sort of highlight these and just really underline these. So a big barrier for holding boundaries is that people feel guilty. So again, it's really important, if that's you, just remember, people will not thank you for holding your boundaries. It's normal and okay to feel guilty when you're holding boundaries, because people are going to kick back against you. But we know that the compassionate action is not always a nice, easy action. So, for example, your client who's calling you 50 times a day, if you pick up 50 times a day, that's not good for them. All you're doing is you're teaching them that they can't cope without you, that they need you, that they're not okay without you, and that the only reason they feel okay is because of you. The compassionate action is to put time boundaries in so that they start to learn over time in a structured way, as I described earlier, that actually I can manage my anxiety for a bit. And then, you know, Natalie will be there when she says she will be. So as a rule of thumb, if you've thought through the boundary and you believe it really is in everyone's best interest, and you still feel a bit guilty, that's okay. It's fine. You can sit with that feeling. The other barrier, I don't have time. And we've covered this one. You don't have time not to. You will be more efficient and more effective when you have good boundaries. So the question I want you to ask yourself is, do I want to be good at my job? And do I want to sort of look after myself? And if the answer is yes, then you don't have time not to have boundaries. And as I said, the feeling that we don't have time to have a break, etc., is coming from that kind of threat place, which our brain has evolved to do, but it's not necessarily true. So you need to take responsibility to train your threat system physiologically into better habits. And when you do that, it's hard, but when you do it, it's going to stop feeling so scary, and you'll be able to balance everyone's needs, including your own. For different people, this can be harder or easier. For many of us, we've been trained since birth to put other people's needs before our own needs. So it might be that your whole life is about putting other people before you, and that this might feel like quite an overwhelming task, but just trying to just little by little put in boundaries, and just start finding a bit more balance. So in summary, boundaries need to be held consistently within each of us. So I need to know what my boundaries are and then stick to those. So if I've said to the client, I will see them at 2 p.m. every day, but won't answer the phone outside of that, I need to do that. They need to be held consistently across the team. So again, this is critical. If often when things are going wrong in services and services saying, you know, we've tried fine, it didn't work, it's often because it hasn't been done consistently, and you've got certain staff members who are not playing ball and who are, you know, giving out the bus tickets when you agreed as a team that you're not going to do that. So you have to know what your team boundaries are and all hold them consistently. And then, of course, hold those consistently for all of the people that you're working with. So it looks like I've written the same thing there 3 times, but there are subtle distinctions. So if client A breaks a window, there needs to be a proportionately similar response as to client B. And I know that our clients might have a range of needs. So again, that's where we have to have conversations and discussions. It needs to make sense, it needs to be proportionate. There will always be a little bit of flexibility depending on people's needs, so that we're being person-centered, but it can't be wildly inconsistent. And they need to be psychologically informed. Tools to strengthen our boundaries: use supervision, talk to your team, know your policies and procedures, and challenge your policies and procedures if you don't think they're psychologically informed. At least know what they are, so that you know where your starting point is. And everyone should be clear on those negotiable versus non-negotiable boundaries. So to support you to do that, I highly recommend our boundaries workshop. It covers a lot of what we've covered today, but as I said, it's like at least an hour doing a quiz. It's very interactive, it's very engaging, to really help your team understand what are the boundaries and why. And then there's some other ones just touching on other things I've mentioned today. So we have an emotional intelligence and resilience workshop, which usually our best-selling training. I don't know if anyone's been on that. So that's all about looking after yourself in a realistic way. We've got one on moral injury and compassion, which again, I'm afraid I haven't had time to sort of go into moral injury today, but it's super relevant and linked to burnout. And we have one on compassion-focused assertiveness skills as well, which is based on principles of nonviolent communication. And then these are links to the other things I've mentioned today. So you've got your self-compassion resource, you've got Leading the Stream, and you've got one of many breathing exercises there. But if you just Google breathing exercises. And that's it for today. So that's my email. They're both my emails. So if you Google Natalie@bgpsych.com or training@bgpsych.com, I'm head of training, so both of them will come through to me. And I would love to hear from you if you do want further training from us. And obviously, Frontline Network have a training fund, so you can apply for funding so that you can actually just get given a grant and some funding to book us to come and deliver this training for you if that's not within your team budget. So thank you very much to the Frontline Network for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to have a look at Q&A. So there's some details of Frontline Network Training Fund there in the chat for you. About 7 minutes. So there's a question about the assertiveness techniques. I did sort of go back and touch a bit more on that. As I said, we have other trainings on assertiveness techniques. The broken record technique is often one that I go to. It's that sort of idea of just repeating without escalating. So just, I know where my boundary is, and I'm going to just state that again and again and again until either you get bored or you actually take it in. How can we deal with setting or implementing boundaries when boundaries and expectations are not implemented in a wider service? I think this is a really good question. I think I've touched on this as well. It is possible for you to hold consistent boundaries when your wider team isn't, but it probably won't be effective, realistically. So within your individual client work, you certainly can and should continue to hold boundaries. It's a bit difficult because if you have those conversations openly with a client, that perpetuates splitting. If you're saying things like, well, the rest of my colleagues aren't doing the right thing, like, we don't want to be giving that message to people. But as much as you can, if you can go back to the team, if you can go back to your manager, focus to come and do a workshop, ideally it needs to be consistently done across the team, otherwise it's going to be much less effective. Any tips for managers who see team members checking emails out of hours, skipping lunch breaks? It's lovely that you know that you want to sensitively raise that. So again, I mean, I'm hoping that my training today, this webinar, came from a compassionate place, that came across. So I think if you're using a similar approach to explain to people that, you know, we want the best from you, we need you to be well in order to work effectively, and helping people to understand, you know, in supervision you can have conversations around understanding, you know, why are you checking your emails out of hours? Is there a way that we can support you to put those boundaries around? Can we think about why this might not be helpful? And again, that sort of what if, like, okay, you're fine this week, but in a year's time when you haven't had a day off, how's your mental health going to be then? So that's not really a specific tip, but I think the fact that you're asking how to do it sensitively is a great start about it. Have team meetings, have a team meeting about team boundaries, because colleagues actually learn from each other, I think, more than a manager or a trainer that's telling them to do something. And actually, I've been in a service, I had a really helpful reflective practice group once where the team were able to say to somebody who had really poor time boundaries, they were able to voice compassionately that actually that person made them feel guilty. And when the staff member heard that from his colleagues, he was like, oh, I'm really sorry, like I'll try harder. I didn't realize I was making you feel bad because I never take a lunch break. So as long as it's not done in a shaming, blaming way, as long as people feel psychologically safe and you've got good relationships with the team, then those sorts of conversations can be quite helpful. Is it possible to recover from burnout while still working? That's a very, very difficult question. It takes a long time to recover from burnout. This is why we need to be trying to prevent burnout. This is why we need to be doing self-care and boundaries every day, integrated with everything, because once you are burnt out, it takes a really long time to come back from it. in actual answer to your question, it depends on your job. Maybe it depends on what your job involves. It depends on how burnt out you are. I think that's a very individual thing. So maybe, but it's difficult. What's the best way of explaining reasons of boundaries to clients? If the service is short-staffed and you don't have time to see them, is it best to be honest? Yeah, I think our clients have amazing BS detectors. I think the more genuine and authentic you can be, the better. You will always have to be aware in the back of your mind of what's appropriate to say and what isn't. So there'll always be things that we can't share or that's not going to be helpful to share with our clients. But the more transparent you can be, the better. And actually, most of the time, I found that, you know, if you are staff, clients are really understanding, and they'll be like, oh no, it's okay, I know you're trying your best. Not everyone, of course, but the majority of the time that's going to be helpful. And the last question, how can you effectively challenge managers who are consistently putting extra pressure on frontline workers with the remit that we need to prioritise clients' needs? Get them to come to one of our 5 trainings. So our 5 trainings and trauma-informed trainings are, they're very much giving the message to managers. We have manager-specific 5 trainings as well to help managers understand that staff wellbeing is a crucial part of PI. I would remind people that 2 out of the 5 areas of PI are about staff wellbeing. So if you sort of look into the PI model, so find those 5 areas of PI, find some literature, it's all in support of the fact that client needs, staff needs need to be prioritised. So what I would do is come at it from an angle of, you know, hey manager, I know you really want the service to be PI, psychologically informed and trauma informed. And did you know that in order to do that really effectively, this is how we do it? So in general, my advice is always positively frame things as much as possible and then sort of add the and onto it. So rather than kind of a negative challenge, which is going to make somebody defensive, trying to get in from an angle of like, I know this is your intention, I know to prioritize clients' needs, but you know, I read this book and what was really clear is that the clients aren't going to get the service that they need if staff are burnt out. It's the fact pretty much every survey that's ever been done shows that the best predictor of client satisfaction is staff wellbeing and staff satisfaction. So all of these things, there's lots of literature out there. So you can use the literature, you can book our training, get that messaging. So it is 1 minute to 20 past, or it's now 20 past. Hopefully that was helpful, that webinar. I think the slides are going to be made available to people. And as I said, do feel free to email me if you want any further information or any further training. Thank you for coming.